Government and defense contractors realize preparing for a contract takes a lot of time, money, and resources. Some people are so busy addressing Section L of the RFP, terms and conditions, that they forget about another aspect, being responsible. Don't miss out on work because the government doesn't think your company is responsible. Today, the Risk GovCon podcast welcomes our expert guests, Bill Walter, Managing Director with Dixon, Hughes, Goodman, and Eric Crusius, a partner with Holland & Knight, as we weigh in on what you need to know to be considered responsible in the eyes of the contracting officer. For the Risk GovCon podcast, I'm your host, Brian Smith. Welcome to the Risk GovCon podcast. I'm your host, Brian Smith. Today, I'm joined by two experts in the government contracting space as we tackle the FAR Part 9, which is basically Contractor Qualifications and Responsibilities. And our two guests today are Bill Walter and Eric Crusius, and they're from the Virginia area. So we are very flattered and honored to have both of them come down today in Atlanta to go over what I think is a pretty compelling discussion and something that I think you're going to get a lot out of. And real quick, the introduction here is Bill Walter is a managing director for Dixon, Hughes, Goodman, where he leads the government contracting advisory panel. And Bill is also a former auditor with DCAA and is currently a faculty member of the George Mason University and the Public Contracting Institute Government Contracts Program. I'm very happy to have Bill with us today. And Eric is a government contracting attorney with Holland & Knight of Tyson, Virginia. He counsels his clients on matters basically related to the Service Contract Act, trade agreements, subcontracts, teaming agreements, and the FAR. So I know we're going to have a pretty in-depth discussion today. But as a trial attorney, Eric has had numerous wins under his belt that stretch over the past 20 years. So welcome, gentlemen, to the studios for the Risk Recon podcast. When we were talking before the session, we were going over a few things, and I was amazed on how many elements there are to the FAR Part 9, the standards that, according to what we were talking about before, if they're not addressed properly, can negatively impact all your hard work that you put into getting a proposal ready, all the preparations, and I want to tackle this today. So, Bill, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Thank you, Brian. As we were talking about earlier, FAR Part 9 is integral to the award of any government contract. A lot of people think it's easy to just go out and win contracts. We've seen it in movies, we hear it on the radio. But actually, being awarded a contract means you got to spend a lot of time and money up front to prepare a bid and proposal. And if you spend a lot of time and effort trying to respond to the government's request for proposal, which is also known as an RFP, some people get very disappointed because at the end of the day, they thought they won, they thought they had this thing nailed, the best approach, the best price, and everything else. But what they sometimes forget about is in order to win a contract, you have to meet two tests. Number one, you have to be responsive to all the elements of the RFP, provide everything that the customer asks for. But the second thing is you have to be a responsible contractor. In FAR Part 9, it says purchases shall be made from and contracts shall be awarded to responsible prospective contractors only. And it uses that word shall. Eric may have a little bit to say about the word shall when it comes to government contracting.
Well, that's a very important word, actually. The shall is another way to say must, but it's a command. So that means that the contracting agency has to undergo that test and to review whether a contractor is actually responsible or not. So there's no ifs, ands, or buts, and you've seen there are protests about that, whether a contractor should have ever gotten the contract because they're not responsible under FAR Part 9 and the test that we'll talk about a little bit later. But that shall, that command is a very key word in FAR Part 9. You
know, what's interesting to me, you would think that you're going to be responsible if you're at a point already doing government contracting, but apparently there's been some large organizations that lost out on some large opportunities for very simple reasons. Bill, you touched on two earlier today. Could you give that another swing?
Yeah, well, those weren't necessarily responsibility determinations, but those are responsive to the request of the RFP. There was one company that had a spreadsheet that the RFP was very specific. It said, fill in your prices for each one of these items, and a number must be placed in each cell in the spreadsheet. Well, a very large contractor didn't put a number in a spreadsheet. because they said it was zero. So I'm not going to put something in. And the government said, well, you didn't follow the rules, you're non-responsive. So there's a simple thing. They didn't put a zero in a cell and they were kicked out. And there was another protest on the same RFP, and another large contractor was kicked out because they added a labor category to the Schedule B that said, we're going to put a program management labor category in here. And the contracting officer said, I didn't want a program management labor category. So therefore, you're non-responsive to the RFP because I only wanted labor rates for the ones that were here. Responsiveness is a pretty tough argument to get across, or a pretty high standard that you have to be able to meet. But responsibility, that's things that people take for granted sometimes. I work with a lot of companies that come in and they say, hey, I want to be a government contractor. I want to get some of that, $600 billion a year of opportunity. It's not that easy. Not only do you have to know the work and understand what has to be done, because the government wants to get work for the money they spend. I mean, they're spending taxpayer dollars.
We're going to talk about 7 particular points that these general standards, you guys are going to elaborate on those. And I think it was during that conversation where I remembered those 2 contractors that lost out on that stuff. Candidly, I'm shocked, because you would think if you don't have information on an application because you just simply don't have exposure to that, that's acceptable. For every box and everything that needs to be checked on these tells me that it's a kick out. They're looking to kick out quickly. So to make it easier on the selection process, there's some truth to that?
I would say there could be. I've never had anybody really admit to that. But when you take a look at some of these decisions that are made as to why somebody was kicked out of the source selection, you kind of got to put yourself in the seat of the contracting officer as well. I got 200 people that have applied. There's no way in creation I can do all this evaluation and award a contract in 30 days. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to identify who made the short list so that I can really evaluate 4 or 5 companies in the relevant range. They knock out these companies because of a technical non-compliance, and then they work with those that complied, and it's pretty much that simple as I see it.
Yeah, and I think sometimes contracting agencies are worried about getting a protest if they allow something that's borderline through. I think Bill's point is great. I think sometimes they just get an overwhelming number of applications or proposals, and this is a way to kind of down select in a natural way that's compliant with the terms of the solicitation. But also I think, sometimes they act as if they're going to get a protest if they let that blank go through when it's really a zero. And that's a way that they can help ensure that they won't get a protest because of that.
I mean, it's good to hear from the perspective of the contracting officer.
You always got to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. Mm-hmm. And I've heard a lot of people who are very disappointed that they didn't win, and they can make a lot of excuses. And sometimes the excuses are valid. But other times government contracting is a very transparent, very publicly viewed item. And if somebody doesn't win, they can file a protest. So there's so many different avenues here that can take up a lot of time. And contracting officers are just human beings. They don't want to be questioned and second guessed.
Let's go ahead and dive into these 7. You highlighted 7 components here to the general standards. So let's dive right in.
Well, the general standards for what is a responsible contractor is identified in FAR Part 9, as you said. And the most common one that most people are accustomed to is that you have to have adequate financial resources to perform the contract. And this is a pretty basic one. This is the one that I ran across at first. The government will use representatives, if it's within the Department of Defense, from the Defense Contract Audit Agency or possibly the Defense Contract Management Agency, to basically take the financial statements of a company and run through financial ratios, the ones that I learned in college in my basic accounting or my basic finance class. They'll look to see what are the current ratios. In other words, are they paying their bills on time? Do they have enough assets to cover their liabilities? Mm-hmm. And then they take a look at what do they think the working capital requirements are going to be under this contract, and does the contractor have enough working capital or access to working capital, such as letters of credit, lines of credit, things like that, to make sure that they're going to be capable of winning this work. There's nothing worse than going out and finding somebody to do the work, and then they go out and pay their employees, they pay for the materials, and then all of a sudden they can't make any more payments because all their cash is gone. And that usually goes back to the buyer to try to figure out, well, how do we get them out of this rut? And that just takes a lot more time.
If you're just joining us, this is the Risk GovCon podcast brought to you by Risk Reconnaissance. And I'm your host, Brian Smith. Today we're being joined by Bill Walter and Eric Crusius on a discussion on FAR Part 9. Thanks, guys. This is for the folks that might be just jumping in right now. So that's one of 7. Go ahead and get to the next one.
The second one is that the contractor has to be able to comply with the required or proposed delivery or performance schedule, taking into consideration all existing commercial and governmental business commitments. So what this is saying is, are you going to be able to do this job? Coming into Atlanta, we're from Washington, D.C. area, and I was laughing as everybody was talking about their traveling complaints here and the traffic and everything else because of the construction, because of everything else. If you drive by a project, oftentimes you'll see nobody's working. And it's because their resources are on another section of the highway or some other road where they're working on that. This is trying to say, let's minimize that. If somebody already has enough work to keep them busy, are they going to be responsible? Can they actually do the work that we're going to give them if they've already got everybody fully occupied? So responsibility isn't just about the financial capability. It's also about, do you have enough resources to get the job done based on all the other work you're already doing?
That's a pretty heavy burden on behalf of that contracting officer to look and see what else is in the pipeline or what else you've already been committed to. How are they doing that? Is there like a system or a database that indicates work in progress, or is it something if it's part of another contract? In other words, if you have a contractor that's doing 7 other jobs, they're engaged in 7 other projects, and that contracting officer saying, hey, we don't think you have the bandwidth for this. Where are they getting the information about the other 7?
I mean, sometimes what the contractor that's putting that proposal in is saying, hey, we'll use the incumbent workforce that the other contractor has hired to do this work. That doesn't always sit well with the incumbent contractor. Some contracting agencies are okay with that because they know that those incumbent workers will get offers of employment to stay on the contract and continue working on the contract. So it'll be a different contractor, but maybe the same people. And that's a way that the incoming contractor can show that they're responsible and they have the wherewithal to do the work. The incumbent contractor is not always really happy about that, and it depends on the language of the solicitation how much of that you can use, how much of the incumbent workforce you can use. There's nothing that says that incumbent contractor can't take those workers with them if they've gotten another award somewhere else.
And other things that they can do, they can take a look and just simply do market research and find out how many contracts have you been awarded. They can take a look on their website and see, because people are always happy to put the announcements of, hey, we won this work, we won this work. For their other federal contracts, they can go into the Federal Procurement Data System, which is a tool that's available to the public as well as the government, and they can go in and see what kind of award you've gotten. And if they're concerned, they can't just say, oh, well, you're not responsible, but it opens up a question that they need to have answered during their discussions with the contractor. This isn't something that they'll just throw out the door, but it certainly would be an item for negotiations and discussions with the contractor.
And to Bill's point about public announcements, it's always funny. We've successfully knocked out companies who said they were small but really not, based on the public announcements of how many contracts they've won. You know, they'll put out a press release every time they win a contract, and then they certify as small. And you add up all the contracts they say they've won, and it's $75 million, but the size standard is $25 million. And there's obviously a disconnect there. Companies have certified it incorrectly. We'll just leave it at that.
Yeah.
That they were small, even despite their public pronouncements.
Because this is what we're saying we're doing, but this is all the stuff that's out there in public record, right?
Well, that's a matter for an entirely different podcast.
Yeah. We'll come back some other time for that.
You're always welcome back.
We'll keep adding 10. We'll do FAR Part 19 next.
Yeah.
Let's take it away. Let's go to the next section.
Okay. The next one is pretty straightforward. The next one is, to be a responsible contractor, you have to have a satisfactory performance record. Most of the RFPs issued by the government will have a section that says, hey, you need to give us representative examples of your past performance, and we can look through those. They'll help demonstrate this. There's also records that are available to the contracting officers on how your performance has been on your other contracts. This is one that's in there, and it's actually pretty much built into many of the requirements in order to award a contract. And then right after that, our next one is to be a responsible contractor, you have to have a satisfactory record of integrity and business ethics. This is one that has really received a lot of focus. You can't go by a year without having some article in newspapers talking about contractors, corrupt contractors, and stuff like that. So the government's been very proactive since about the 90s with the defense industrial initiatives to really make sure that contractors not only say that they're ethical, but how are they communicating? What's the tone from the top? Do they have an ethics policy and procedure? If a problem has come up, have they notified the contracting officer like they're supposed to? This is another area where the contracting officers, if they have a suspicion, they'll hold that out for discussions and negotiations to say, well, what about this? What about that? Unless they do have some other issues that we'll talk about in the last point.
It's pretty subjective, I would imagine, on behalf of the contracting officer, whether or not they're judging the ethical statement or the history or the background that's been provided by the contractor. So is that, I guess that I would imagine it's a pretty important point. I mean, you got to have it.
Yeah, I think it's a very important point. I don't think it's something where you're going to see a checklist of things, but it's just a reminder. Our company, we're an accounting firm. Before we take on a new client, we have to make sure that they're reputable, that they're going to pay their bill. So we'll take a look at what public filings might be available, things like that. It's not a formal background check, but it's kind of doing a background check to make sure that, hey, we're going to be working for companies that if we do something, it's not going to embarrass us. So that's just a part of good business that they've actually built into FAR Part 9.
I want somebody that's ethical working on the stuff that some of these contracts are going and performing for, some of these contractors.
The next one is the longest one, and this one basically just says, make sure you have the necessary organization, experience, accounting, gotta love that one, gotta have the good accountants, and operational controls and technical skills, or the ability to attain them. It says when you're working on government contracts, not only do you have to be able to perform, but if it's a contract to build a nuclear reactor and you've provided IT services in the past, do you really have the staffing and the backdrop and the capability to do that? So it's making sure you're bidding on things that you know how to do, because the government wants to make sure at the end of the day they've got the product. So this is saying, take a look at it. Do they have the tools necessary? If there's going to be a really big contract with a lot of accounting requirements, do they have the necessary tool sets available, business systems, things like that?
Again, that's an area where you're just making sure, because I have clients that they've been IT companies and they decided to go into a training area. They'll win a training contract, and then from there it'll go into something medical. It started off with IT, and then the contract opportunities come up, and it's almost like they're chasing that. And we have an issue on the insurance side where the underwriters are going, wait a minute, this is an IT-based company. Why are they now doing training, doctrine training, or why are they training this, or what are they going to do next? And it throws everybody off. But that's when you have to educate the underwriters about the availability of these contracts and what they can compete for. It's already been vetted, of course. If they won the contract, the government's saying, hey, you've got our blessing. We know you can handle it. At least we believe you can handle it from everything you've told us. And that's a very important point, not only from your stand, from where you guys stand, but also from what we try to do on a daily basis too with our clients.
Right, and if you don't have those resources available, or if you haven't done it in the past, it's fun to remember Amazon a decade or so ago was selling books online. Today they sell everything online. It's, just because I haven't done it before doesn't mean I can't do it. Your responsibility means you have to be able to describe how are you going to jump into that new pathway? How are you going to get those new resources? So if you're going from IT to training, how are you going to make that jump? And how well you describe that is going to help bridge the gap to show you are responsible for that particular item.
Yeah, because it's such an amorphous standard, right? That it's not you have to have X number of dollars or X number of people or X source of supply. It's a judgment call. These are all judgment calls, and it's based on how well a lot of it goes into the proposal. How well can you convey what you can do or what you're capable of doing in that proposal? So having a great proposal writer that reflects what your capabilities are is really paramount in this instance.
Our sixth one, we're almost done with the list here. Number 6 is to be responsible, you have to be able to demonstrate that you have the necessary production, construction, technical equipment, and facilities, or the ability to obtain them. There are companies who are going after new things. So if you don't have the resources, you don't have a big hangar to disassemble an airplane, but you want to go into the airplane refurbishment business, you have to be able to identify, how am I going to do that? Are you going to be teaming? Maybe I have a team member that has those resources combined with my skills, and we pull it together. Here, to be responsible, you have to be able to demonstrate that you've done it, or you can demonstrate how you're going to do it. And then our last point, number 7, is the responsible contractor has to be otherwise qualified and eligible to receive an award under applicable laws and regulations. This particular test says, okay, if you're a suspended or debarred contractor, There's laws that say that you can't be awarded a contract unless you have all sorts of approvals and the need can be identified that you're the only person that can do it. You've got this catch-all at the end of the day. Say, if none of these top 6 meet, let's just make sure that there are laws in place that aren't stopping that person from coming in. And one of the things that this particular standard spells out specifically is there is a prohibition on contracting with inverted domestic corporations. And what that means is if I'm offshore, I set up my company offshore so that I can avoid paying taxes here in the U.S. Congress a couple of years ago came in and said, that doesn't make much sense. We want people to provide the services that are a part of our community. They're paying taxes here, so that's what we want to have. So that prohibition, I think, is one of the relatively new prohibitions that we've had.
Back to suspension and debarment, that's a whole process that the government goes through. If it suspects that a contractor, or it knows that a contractor is not responsible, but is still receiving contracts, agencies can start a suspension and debarment process where they require the contractor to essentially bring forth information as to how they're responsible, why they're responsible. And it's up to that company or individual to show that they are responsible in order to avoid being suspended or debarred from doing contracts, having contracts with the federal government.
I got a couple of questions for you. As we talk about these 7 aspects here on the responsible prospective contractor piece, what is an example of, or what's one of the most common problems that people have faced when they're doing this, when they're trying to doing the proposal, taking this into consideration, what we just talked about today? What's a common mistake that could be made by a proposal writer? Given the venue we have right now, you could tell them this: if you just figured this out or did this better, it might be best for you.
Just at least from my perspective, because through the protest process, I see a lot of proposals not putting in the information in the proposal itself. This happens a lot with incumbents who think that the agency already knows what they're doing, so there's no need to put more in. But for a responsibility part, especially for newer contractors, getting all that information into the proposal, especially sometimes with page limits, is a difficult thing. It's more of an art than a science. So I think proposal writers, the daunting task they have, especially when faced with page limits, is getting this information into the proposal that conveys to the agency that they're responsible enough to have the contract. So I would say that's the biggest point.
The other thing I was wondering about, and we didn't touch on it here, but it's something that I wanted to ask about because we had talked about it earlier before the show, the debrief. This is thoughts on that, gentlemen?
No, I think that there are a number of things that come into the responsibility element of this. If the government's doing its review and you say that you have all these resources, you have all this equipment, you have these facilities available, and if they've come in and they've done their review and said, well, these facilities really aren't available, or these facilities, we went out and we took a walkthrough and we saw, I actually had one company was bidding on a transportation contract and they said they had 100,000 square feet laydown yard. Well, the contracting officer went out and they took a tour of the facility and they found that the 100,000 foot laydown yard was completely packed. There was nowhere to put any of the new stuff that was going to be coming in that had to be packaged and shipped. They said they had 100,000 square feet, but the contracting officer said, well, none of that was available. There's something that says you're going to be identified as being not responsible because you don't have the necessary facilities to be able to take care of what their needs are. That also ties into the other test up above. Hey, we've got all this other commercial business that's filling up the yard, so maybe we just don't have space to handle the government's equipment to come in and make sure it's cleaned and boxed and prepped for shipment.
And a debrief is just so important because it's a way to learn from your mistakes. If the award that was made to the other company was, correct, you can learn where you faltered, so that way the next time this work or other work comes around, you can improve upon that. Maybe the agency points out something like what Bill said, and they know the next time they should clear out that space before the agency comes and takes a walk. Because maybe that stuff that the contracting agency saw when they toured the space would have been gone next week, but they didn't convey that information or something like that. So it's great lessons learned just to go to the debrief and figure out. You could even, if you won, go to a debrief and find out what you did well and things that maybe you didn't do quite as well, but you can improve upon even more so your proposal's more unstoppable next time you come around.
It's just always a good practice to have an after-action review. Basically, what you've done the exercise. Now let's find out from the experts on what was good, what was bad, and what was indifferent, and figure out what we can do to improve it.
You've spent so much time and money on that proposal. Mm-hmm. Getting a debrief is, and they're not always mandatory, so you have to look to see whether it's mandatory under your contract.
And I found that the companies that are more successful seem to have more of those debriefs, and they're very thoughtful as they're going in. They're not just accepting the words, they're asking questions so that they can, as Eric said, they can figure out how can they leverage what was given the most points in this proposal and figure out they may have some shortcomings that they can shore up to give them additional points in the next award.
Well, gentlemen, I really appreciate you coming in today, talking to our audience about what I would say is a very relevant issue. And once again, we were joined by Bill Walter and Eric Crusius, and they have been able to go through, I guess, a relatively short amount of time and give us some very valuable insight on FAR Part 9. Thank you for joining us at the Risk GovCon podcast. I'm Brian Smith, and this episode's been brought to you by Risk Reconnaissance. You can find today's show and other episodes at theriskrecon.com/podcast. That's THERiskrecon.com/podcast. Risk Reconnaissance. You support the warfighter. We support you.
As a government or defense contractor, you know insurance requirements can be different and sometimes challenging more than standard commercial business operations. So why place your risk in the hands of a commercial insurance agent with little or no experience in your unique operations? Entrusting your coverage needs to the right insurance team saves time, money, and resources. The Insurance Office of America Government Contracting Team manages client needs for Defense Base Act insurance, proposal rate development, and multi-state workers' compensation programs, just to name a few. Interested in learning more? Contact Brian Smith for additional details and whether our skills can meet or exceed your expectations. IOA Government and Defense Contracting Practice. We have your back.